Welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On the last podcast, we looked at what happened when supply and demand curves shift in the opposite directions, and we did two of those. And now we want to look at what happens when supply and demand shift in the same direction, and we're going to do two of those as well. And again, I forgive for some of the words down here, and we'll just try to work around that the best that we can. So let's get right into this, and let's look at what happens when we get an increase in demand and an increase in supply. So that means demand's going to shift, increase to the right. Supply is going to shift, increase to the right. So both curves are going to shift to the right. So let's go ahead and draw it. The demand curve is going to increase. That means shift to the right, so that's D2. And the supply curve is going to increase, so that means it's also going to shift to the right. So the supply curve is going to shift to the right. And then my new equilibrium point is going to be right here where the new demand curve hits the new supply curve. And I can see very clearly that that equilibrium is moving to the right. It's moving to the right. I can see that very clearly. And so I'm going to come here and I'm going to mark my new quantity. And my new quantity is going to be Q2. That's right there. It's going to be my new quantity. And then the price is, well, it's going to depend. The way that I drew it looks like price maybe went up a little bit, but again, I didn't tell you the magnitude of the shift. So, if the demand curve had, shifted to the right just a little bit, that would still be a right shift in the demand curve, be a little tiny right shift. Then the equilibrium price would have actually gone down. So again, this is like what we did on these top two graphs up here, where quantity was indeterminate, only now it's going to be the price that is indeterminate. I can't quite tell if the price went up or went down. It just depends on the magnitude of the shift. So we're going to say this. Let's record everything that happened. We had an increase in demand. That means the demand curve shifted to the right. We had an increase in supply. That means the supply curve shifted to the right. We have an increase in quantity. The quantity clearly went up, but the price is now indeterminate. We cannot say what happened to the price. It depends on the magnitude of these shifts. So increased demand, increased supply, increased quantity, price indeterminate. Let's do one more of these. Last one, decreased demand, decreased supply. That means demand shifts left, supply shifts left. Both curves are going to shift to the left. Both curves are going to shift to the left. Decreased demand, decreased supply. So let's draw it up. Decreased demand means demand goes left. So there's our new demand curve. And decreased supply means the supply curve shifts left. And so there's the decrease in supply. And we can see for sure the equilibrium quantity, the new equilibrium, is moving to the left. So let's mark our quantity, and the quantity clearly went down. It decreased. It went left. But what about the price? Well, the way I drew it, it kind of went down a little bit, but again, it depends on the magnitude of the shift. It could have gone up, so we really don't know for sure. So we're going to record our four things. We're going to say decrease in demand, demand shifted left, decrease supply, supply shifted left, decrease quantity, quantity clearly went down, and then price, there it is, indeterminate. We can't quite tell at this new equilibrium whether that price is going to go up or down. The way I drew it, it went down, but you might have drawn those demand and supply left shifts a little differently, and price might have actually gone up. So we just can't tell. So decrease demand, decrease supply, decrease quantity, decrease price. Let's just draw a couple quick conclusions here. First of all, notice that none of these say decrease quantity demanded. Why not? because all the curves shifted. The only time you say decreased quantity demanded is when you get back to here where only one curve shifted. If only one curve shifts, then you're going to move along the other curve, and that's where you get the quantity demanded. Okay, so you're only going to see the quantity demanded or quantity supplied language when you have one curve shift. But over here, we have two curves shift. So you will never see quantity demand and quantity supplied. They're all changes in demand and supply. Also notice this. When demand and supply shift in the opposite direction, you will be able to tell what happened to price. So let's just record that. When they go in the opposite direction, when supply and demand go in the opposite direction, that is to say, one of them decreases, one of them increases, then you will be able to say what happens. You'll be able to predict what happens to price. The quantity will be indeterminate. And then down here, when supply and demand shift in the same direction, they both increase or they both decrease, when they shift in the same direction, then you will always be able to predict what happens to quantity, and it will be price that is indeterminate. Now, one last thing to say. Notice that there are only 4 things that can happen when supply and demand curves shift. Okay? You can have one shift, which will result in one of these 4 graphs, or you can have 2 shifts that will result in one of these 4 graphs. So there's really only 8 answers to supply and demand. Okay, so it's going to get more complicated, but there's ultimately 8 possible mechanical answers to supply and demand, whether you get 1 curve shift or 2 curve shift. We'll talk more about the real intuition of supply and demand on the next video. This has been Mr. Hagan on another Econ podcast, and we'll see you on that next video.